Thank you for joining us this evening. You are now attending the webinar entitled Country Soul, Music and Race in the American South. Our leader for this session is Dr. Charles L. Hughes, Associate Professor, History, Urban Studies at Rhodes College. We are also joined by two members of our talented 2425 Teacher Advisory Council, Raven Cathey and Marcel Rich. We appreciate you being here, and we just look forward to having you in the room. Dr. Charles L. Hughes is Associate Professor of History and Urban Studies. Dr. Hughes earned his PhD in U.S. History from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he also earned BA and MA degrees in African American Studies. From 2015 to 2024, he was the director of the Lynn and Henry Turley Memphis Center at Rhodes. His research focuses on popular culture in the United States, most specifically African American music and its relationship to larger historical changes. I lost my place here. His acclaimed first book, Country Soul, Making Music and Making Race in the American South, was named one of the best music books of 2015 by Rolling Stone and No Depression. And in 2021, he published Why Bushwick Bill Matters, a critical biography of the disabled hip-hop star. He is co-editor of the American Music Series at the University of Texas Press, and he also serves on the faculty editorial board for the journal Southern Cultures, which he guest edited a special issue on disability in the South. He has published numerous essays and given numerous talks for a range of audiences, and was a regular contributor to 2 seasons of Teaching Hard History podcast produced by the Southern Poverty Law Center's Learning for Justice Project. In 2023, he wrote the liner notes for the 10th anniversary reissue of Jason Isbell's celebrated album Southeastern. He is currently working on a book about the history of African Americans and professional wrestling in the United States, as well as articles on disability in public and popular music. He is the co-founder of the digital music newsletter, No Fences Review, and he is a voter for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. To all of our teachers who are here tonight, I present to you our speaker and leader for this session, Dr. Charles Hughes. Dr. Hughes, we look forward to your talk. Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you so much, Mike, and thank you to Raven Ferguson and everybody else here at the National Humanities Center. What an honor and a privilege to be a part of this series and to do work with this remarkable organization that is so important anytime, but feels especially important right now. I'm also really privileged to be here because my parents were public high school teachers. And although we have, I know we have educators from various different levels and places all over on the call, but I have long understood and valued the importance of great educators throughout the entire youth and adulthood of everybody who gets the privilege of working with them. So it's always a pleasure when I get to speak to educators because I'm kind of in my family business, although I went up to the college teaching, but it's such a privilege to be here. Thank you all so much. And in fact, in that spirit, I always like to start when I am doing something like this, thinking about some of the teachers that I have had. And I only, I could go on for an hour just listing names, but anytime I get to do anything, but especially to talk to educators, I always love to talk to a couple people whose work I might not mention as we go along, although I'm going to bring in some other names and particularly books that I think might be useful for y'all, certainly were useful for me, but who nonetheless are really crucial to how I think about this stuff. And I wanted to mention David Cantwell, music journalist and critic and author. He's also my partner in crime over at No Fences Review. I don't know that there's a better country music writer than David Cantwell. And he continues to be really, really important and insightful in thinking about country in past, present, and probably future as well. And then also Dr. Zandria Robinson, sociologist currently at Georgetown University, was in Memphis with us for a few years at Rhodes College. She is a native Memphian. And my conversations with Dr. Robinson and her incredible writing on the variety of topics including music, has been so pivotal to helping me frame my thinking, not only about the music from Memphis specifically, but also music from anywhere, both in terms of its sound and its meaning, but also the role it plays in our culture and in our history. So David Cantwell and Xandria Robinson, two names to know, two writers to read. And on top of everything else, they're both great writers. I've tried to only spotlight people tonight who I think are particularly good writers and who I love reading and who I look up to in that way as well. So what I want to do tonight is kind of talk a little bit about the work and the thinking that went into this book that Mike mentioned, that is actually this month celebrating its 10th birthday. It's kind of wild to think of this being out in the world for that long. But I want to talk a bit about this book, kind of what I'm thinking about in relation to this story of country soul and music and race in the South. I want to kind of map out some of the big stuff, do a couple of specific examples, both as a way to illustrate what I'm talking about, but also to kind of think a little bit about the music itself as a way to understand this story. And then I also want to kind of talk a bit at the end about a really exciting and important development from after I published the book, because looking back from 10 years now, a lot of things have happened, and I want to spotlight one thing that I think is particularly important, but also particularly illuminating, thinking again about this longer history. I certainly will try to work in time for questions as we go, but I definitely will save some time at the end because I can't wait to hear what y'all are interested in or want to think about as well. So I came to this story as a researcher for both sort of scholarly, historian kind of reasons and also personal reasons. I was fascinated both as a historian and as a music critic, but also as a music fan, about what I perceive to be a rather fascinating paradox in particularly the Southern soul music that I really loved so much. I was specifically interested in how it was that in the 1960s and 70s, so many of my favorite Southern soul recordings, particularly in places like Memphis and Muscle Shoals, were produced with a largely white studio band or with white songwriters or with an integrated ensemble. And I was so fascinated both by what that suggested about our ideas about music, black music, white music, etc., but also how it was that this could exist at the very moment when civil rights protests and the backlash to those protests were happening quite literally in some cases down the streets from these studios where interracial ensembles were making such great music. And as I began to work on this story, I realized that it was not just about trying to understand how this could happen, but also try to contextualize this story in a longer history of the South and a longer history of the United States, and use the music and the people who made it to try to think through some bigger and more complicated questions as well. As a teacher, as a listener, as a critic, as a historian, I've always tried to think about the music at the center of the story. And this offered me an opportunity to do that in some ways that I think led in some very interesting directions, or at least I hope they're interesting in helping me to understand some bigger questions. So in thinking about this, I ultimately came to focus on the historical impacts of an integrated cadre of studio musicians, songwriters, and producers in Memphis and Nashville, Tennessee, and in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, an interconnected recording economy that I termed the country soul triangle. In the 60s and 70s, the musicians who worked in the country soul triangle produced a vast catalog of popular and acclaimed recordings that brought international renown to studios like Stax and Fame Studios in Muscle Shoals, and made each city's signature sound, the Memphis sound, the Nashville sound, and the Muscle Shoals sound, into a marker of quality and authenticity. People bought records in this period simply because they advertised themselves as having the Nashville sound or the Memphis sound or the Muscle Shoals sound. These studios and musicians won accolades from the national music industry, who heralded them as exemplars of professionalism and versatility, and also from local leaders who championed them as politically and economically crucial to their respective communities. Now, Triangle musicians worked with everyone from Bob Dylan to Bob Marley, but they were most identified with country music, soul music, and those genres' musical hybrids. Backing up everyone from Aretha Franklin to Hank Williams Jr., the musicians of the country soul triangle produced much of the period's enduring and relevant music. They also became a favorite metaphor during this period for the contested state of the South and the United States. Politicians, writers, and the business community pointed to the commercial boom and cross-racial music of integrated studios like Stax in Memphis or elsewhere as a sign of Southern economic renaissance and social progress. There were newspaper and magazine articles in this period that would point to Southern music being made in these places as being as important an example of integration success as what was happening in schools or lunch counters or other perhaps more famous sites of civil rights breakthrough. But those same politicians, writers, and business leaders also exploited the boundaries between country and soul by heralding them as expressions of opposites, of opposite political ideology, opposite racial identity, and country and soul music became very well-known symbolic metaphors for not just music, but also for identity and one's position in the cultural politics of the United States. This seeming paradox of the black and white musicians creating country soul defined a broader societal uncertainty about the continuing tension between interracial cooperation and racial division, which became perhaps the dominant debate in U.S. racial politics in the era of civil rights, black power, and white backlash. The relationship between country and soul, in other words, was America in microcosm. The Triangle's musicians stood at the center of this potent symbolism. They were the first to promote their recordings as symbols of integration. It was they who were the first to assert that studios like Stax and its integrated house band Booker T and the MGs were symbols of integration success. And they continued to play interracially, even as their music took on such divergent connotations. Conversely, at the same time, it was also those musicians who capitalized on the polarization by making records that explicitly appealed to a supposedly racially and politically divided marketplace. Just as in earlier eras of the recording industry, which I'll talk about in a minute, country and soul became symbolic shorthand for identity. And throughout the 60s and 70s, Triangle musicians both challenged and reinforced the racial perceptions surrounding their music and made little attempt to reconcile this contradiction. They worked and created music within both of these ideas and impulses at the same time. And in fact, one could argue, and I guess I do, that it was the most important part of their job, was working within this deeply poignant contradiction. It's evident in the lyrics, the sounds, the imagery, and the context from so many recordings from this classic era. Now, of course, it's not like this was new in the 1960s. Musical genre had long been a stand-in for racial politics, and in fact, it was crucial even at the dawn of the recording industry in the early 20th century. Now, of course, while music has never necessarily respected racial boundaries, there were always black and white musicians making music together, and musicians who were neither black nor white making music across racial lines. But when the recording industry begins to market these genres in order to sell records, they increasingly become racially specific and often racially divided. In the 1920s, as hillbilly music, which is what country music ultimately becomes, and race records, which was sort of a designation for any music, particularly that wasn't gospel, that was performed by black artists. So it could be blues or jazz or, frankly, hillbilly music, right? But if it was produced by a black artist, it would be marketed as a race record. What this did was not only set up this identifiable difference in which people could say that they were or that they listened to hillbilly music, country music, or race music, blues music, jazz music, etc., but also a way that these genres could reflect the continued segregation of the Jim Crow era. The historian Carl Hagstrom Miller, whose book I have put up there, talks brilliantly about this history and about many, not only of the larger stories, but the specific recordings and other things that made up this crucial era. And so from the 1920s forward, from the very beginning of the ideas of country music and what becomes soul music, they are racially designated and racially divided, even though listeners and musicians never necessarily respected those lines. It did nonetheless mean, though, that in terms of what records were available in which stores, what songs got played on which radio stations, etc., that hillbilly and race music reflected the segregation of the society around it. And people increasingly could think of identifying musical genre not only with a sound or a style, but also with the race of its creators. Rock and roll in the 1950s both challenged and also weirdly kind of reinforced this division as well. Rock and roll, very famously to this day, is talked about as the blending of country and blues, or country and R&B. In fact, in a very interesting and poignant metaphor, you will often hear rock and roll talked about as a kind of interracial marriage, which is particularly interesting given the prohibition and fear of interracial marriage, particularly in the Jim Crow South, but also across the country. And there's no doubt that rock and roll, in both its integrated sound and the fact that black and white listeners were coming together to listen to it in defiance of segregation, there's no doubt that rock and roll transgressed racial boundaries. However, rock and roll also ultimately led to the association, particularly in Memphis, with white artists. Elvis Presley's story is complicated and difficult to even try to sum up superficially. I highly recommend Michael Bertrand's book, Race, Rock, and Elvis, thinking about Elvis's place and rock and roll's place within the South of the 50s and 60s as well. But there's no doubt that the rise of artists like Elvis Presley, white musicians who could successfully incorporate black sound and disproportionately benefit from it, there's no doubt that that also reinforced the idea that the racialization of musical genre and the idea of even the blends that would seemingly transcend or transgress segregation would not be benefiting black creators or black musicians equally. All of this went into the work and the context of the integrated studios of the Country Soul Triangle. There is no doubt that the work that was going on in Memphis and in Muscle Shoals and also in Nashville was both a literal and figurative defiance of white supremacy and specifically of segregation. The music that was made among a group of professionals, professional musicians, absolutely defied what people thought could or could not happen within an integrated workspace or anything else. And additionally, beyond that, the country-influenced soul music of Joe Tex, or the soul-influenced music of Charlie Rich, or other artists, signaled the way that the blend of country and soul might symbolize the liberating power of the music being made in these studios in the context of a rapidly changing South and United States. And this was certainly true. However, even the most obvious moments of integration and music could sometimes hide a more complex or ambivalent story. There is no more definitive Memphis soul song than Green Onions. The single that was recorded by the Stax Records house band in 1962 became a breakout hit for the band and really helped solidify the idea of what Memphis soul and Southern soul would sound like. The four musicians who recorded Green Onions brought to this instrumental what they knew from playing in a variety of different bands around Memphis and elsewhere. And in the interplay between Booker T. Jones, Steve Cropper, Al Jackson, and Louis Steinberg, you can hear not only the work of seasoned musicians figuring out something new from what they had heard and played for audiences before, but you could also hear the interplay that would come to symbolize the musical integration that many identified and continue to identify in Stax and elsewhere. So let's hear a little bit of Green Onions. Mike, if you can cue that up and play some of that. Thank you. So in that spare groove of Green Onions, you hear the drums from Al Jackson Jr. bouncing off of the organ from Booker T. Jones, Louis Steinberg's thumping bass, and Steve Cropper piercing guitar. It is a song that is simple and yet contains layers of sound. And for many folks, particularly by the time Booker T and the MGs break out with a big hit and become stars in their own right, Green Onions symbolizes not only Memphis, but also the integrated music at places like Stax. But that is true, but there is an interesting story that goes alongside it. The most famous lineup of Booker T and the MGs is the one you see here on the right, in which Booker T. Jones and Al Jackson are joined by two white players, Steve Cropper on guitar and Donald Duck Dunn on bass. And so it was a perfect image for the integrated civil rights movement to have two black musicians and two white musicians working together. And again, yes, but when Green Onions was recorded, Duck Dunn was not in the band, and instead the bass player was a black musician named Louis Steinberg. And in the aftermath of Green Onions and Booker T and the MG's success, Steinberg expressed discontent with what he felt was the potential attempt by Steve Cropper to get his friend Duck Dunn in as the bass player and remove him. Steinberg suggested it was about race, and while there may have been many reasons for why this took place, race certainly could have been one of them. And in fact, Booker T. Jones himself, in his recent autobiography, Time is Tight, suggests a more complicated story around Booker T and the MGs than sometimes was promoted or still gets talked about. I highly recommend Booker T. Jones's autobiography, both for what it teaches us about music and race, but also for the way in which Jones, who is a classically trained, university trained, but also nightclub trained performer, talks about the way that he created music, both as a performer and a producer. It's a really beautiful book and a lot of really great stuff in it. It's one of my favorite kind of recent music memoirs. So even these stories suggest something that is perhaps being overly simplified or at least not talked about as much. Now, as the country soul triangle grew, the musicians working in the three cities both expanded their influence, had more and more success, but also reinforced their reputations as effective synthesizers of pop, rock, soul, and country. And indeed also, as the 60s and the early 70s became more divided and more tense, as continuing symbols of the effectiveness and integration. This became more challenging in an era in which country became the sound of authentic, even politically conservative whiteness. It gets an association, which is a very active process that went on, in which the country industry and conservative politicians very much sought alliance with each other to appeal to who they saw as their shared audience. While soul became the assertive and celebratory soundtrack of civil rights, Black power, and Afrocentric consciousness. Two great books about this. Like I said, I like recommending other great writing. The country music story of this period is told brilliantly by a historian named Diane Pecknold in her book, The Selling Sound, talking about the way this was an active process and how that worked. And Mark Anthony Neal, who is one of the best, I think, current writers on Black music. There's several books that he has written that I recommend highly, but I thought I would shout out What the Music Said, in which he thinks about the ways that Black popular music both informs and is informed by what he calls Black public culture, sort of political, cultural, social worlds of Black communities. And of course, particularly those of you thinking about the country side of the story might already be thinking, Black country artists like Charley Pride and Linda Martell were defying this seeming segregation by making space for themselves and other Black country artists within the Nashville mainstream. Charley Pride becomes the only major Black country star of this period, but there were many others who were promoted in the aftermath of his success as other examples of how country music could appeal across racial lines and could itself reflect cultural progress. During all of this period, and in all of this music, and all of these changes, the musicians of the Country Soul Triangle were engaging with this dynamic on almost all, or at least a large number, of their important recordings, even when it conflicted with, or at least complicated, the realities of their cross-racial sound and integrated workplaces. Just as Green Onions by Booker T and the MGs is a definitive example of Memphis soul, I'll Take You There by the Staple Singers from 1972 is a definitive example of the soul music from Muscle Shoals. The Staple Singers, a gospel family group with roots in Mississippi who emerge in Chicago, become hugely important gospel performers. They also get involved with the civil rights movement. They work with Martin Luther King. They begin recording protest music and other things to try to respond to the growing activism and how their music could be a part of it. And in 1969, Stax Records president Al Bell, the first Black president of Stax Records, signs the Staple Singers, believing that the Staple Singers could represent what he hoped the label could be, which is not only a site of hit records and great music, but also could link up more fully with the Black freedom movement as it was taking place around the country and the world. Ironically enough, to make this deep, funky, soulful, gospel-influenced music, he sends the Staple Singers to work in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, where he had begun sending Stax artists and whose studio musicians were entirely a white group. So you have right there the promise of the country soul moment, where you have Black and white working together, demonstrating the fallacy of segregation and pursuing cultural progress, even just by working together and making music. I'll Take You There is a fascinating example even beyond that. The song, which I'll play a little bit of here in a second, in case you haven't heard it, or if you have, it's never a bad thing to hear I'll Take You There. The song is built around a rhythm track, or kind of a rhythm arrangement, that the Muscle Shoals musicians had picked up from a recent record that had been released in Jamaica, kind of an early ska record that paves the way for reggae in the 70s, and which the musicians in Muscle Shoals were just totally blown away by. They loved this kind of new rhythm of this Jamaican music, and so they start just jamming in the studio around this groove from this ska record, and over the top of this, Mavis Staples, who is the primary lead singer for the Staple Singers, begins to kind of improvise some lyrics that are really just kind of classic gospel and civil rights movement lyrics, talking about moving on, moving up, and where she hopes that she and the community will go together. Al Bell recognizes this as potentially something that could not only be good, but be a hit. And so he works with them, produces the track, and creates this classic kind of microcosm and encapsulation of what the country soul moment represented in the way that it could be a sign of things changing. It also becomes this remarkable hit record that to this day, for good reason, is one that people point to as being one of the great recordings, not only to come out of Muscle Shoals or the South, but indeed anywhere during this period. So I want to play a bit of I'll Take You There. And just remember, the interplay here is between a group of white musicians from Muscle Shoals, Alabama, working with a rhythm that they had adapted from a Jamaican ska recording. And over the top of that, you have Mavis Staples and her father, Roebuck Staples, and her two sisters, Yvonne and Cleotha Staples, improvising and pulling together something that drew deeply from their gospel roots, but also from the music and the work that they had done in the civil rights movement. It's hard to imagine a better example of the promise and the potential of this country soul moment. So, yeah, Mike, you want to play a little bit of I'll Take You There. So again, there is this real power in that music that reflects not only where it's coming from and who's making it, but also the context, not only of the civil rights movement, but of cultural change in the United States. I want to pause here. I don't know if there are questions, Mike, if there's anything, we take a couple minutes here before I go on and see what folks are wondering about, if anything.
All right, good deal. Thank you for that. I remind everyone, if you should have any questions, please do not hesitate to drop them into the chat. Dr. Hughes, I will tell you that I was unaware of the Jamaican ska song, which influenced that. And I've listened to that record my entire life at family get-togethers. I Googled it, and maybe it's The Liquidator. Does that ring a bell? The Liquidator by Harry J. All-Stars?
That's
wow. Right. I was not aware of that at all. Thank you for that. Again, I'll encourage you to please enter the questions that you all should have in the chat. One question that I have, and maybe we can address this a little bit later if necessary, but considering the historical roots of country music, and obviously the contributions of Black artists, musical tradition. How do you see the current perception and representations of Black artists in country music aligning or diverging? Is that a later question?
That is, I will be talking about that a bit, but I will say, I mean, it's such a great question, and it's such a crucial issue historically. But yeah, I'll talk a little bit more about the present day or contemporary question. But one thing I would note right away is that for people like Charlie Pride and Linda Martell, for earlier Black country artists, and also Pride and Martell's contemporaries, so much of what they had to do in their work was sort of validate or authenticate that they deserved to be taken seriously as country singers. And it had nothing to do with anything other than their race. They're constantly sort of forced to have to kind of prove their bona fides as country musicians, even though, you know, they had every bit of the legitimacy and every bit of the love and talent for the music. And that's something that's continued forward to this day. It started to change a little bit, but one of the things that I still notice, and I'll talk a little bit more a bit later, is how so many Black country musicians who kind of emerge out and get publicized or promoted or arrive on the scene, one of the first things that they are either expected to do or kind of have to do is sort of prove that they're country, right? And white musicians never have to do this. White artists, I mean, there is definitely, you know, there's sort of like, I'm more country than you, but it almost never happens that white artists are sort of assumed to be interlopers, right? And I think that is very much an older story that artists, again, from this era, but also then moving forward and also even earlier, are constantly having to kind of prove that they're country. And again, just to make it as plain as I can, they're country, right? So that's something that's really interesting about this period in the 60s and 70s. Another thing that I would just add is that this is also in the 60s and 70s, a period where you get a ton of R&B and soul stars who make country albums. Of course, Ray Charles very successfully in 1964, I think. I can't remember the exact year. But in the early 60s, he has this huge surprise hit with modern sounds in country and Western music. And in that aftermath, there's all of these other Black soul and pop artists who are making a country album, and they're all pretty great, and they're really interesting, and they reflect the particular sounds of the people who do them. But so many of them either have country in the title of the album, like not just that it's country music, but like My Country or Bobby Womack Goes C&W, right, or those sorts of things. But also the iconography is like as country as possible. And to me, it's very clear that part of that is to sort of show that this is something Black artists have a right to do as well. And just again, the opposite is not happening at all in this period or later, where white artists have much greater privilege to cross over into, you know, other genres, at least, and then be promoted by the recording industry and others, not as being potentially suspicious, but actually like being like geniuses or innovative, or look at this talented white artists who prove they can do other things. That's a bit of a roundabout way, and I will address that more later, though. But that's a great and crucial question.
And another quick question about the Muscle Shoals and Staple Singers connection. Question from Dory. Is that connection between Muscle Shoals and Staple Singers also how we get Mavis Staples and Papa Staples on the band's song The Weight? Are you familiar with that?
Oh, I am. And I love that. I love that recording of The Weight. It's not, the Staple Singers were pretty, I mean, in a way it is, just because the Staple Singers recordings that they made in the early 70s were so beloved by a large group of people. But the Staple Singers had actually been well known by a lot of white rock artists before this. I mean, Bob Dylan and Mavis Staples very famously were friends, and, you know, potentially maybe more than friends for a little while. But Dylan was really influenced by the Staples. The Staples were also very influenced by Dylan. Pop Staples apparently heard Blowin' in the Wind and was like, well, if he can do this, then why are we not doing this? Which is also Sam Cooke was inspired to write A Change Is Gonna Come because of Bob Dylan. But the band, of course, had worked with Bob Dylan, but also beyond that, I think it was just the recognition of the affinity of the sound, right? Like, so no, it's not directly because of it, but one story that is a kind of, it's not exactly about the Staple Singers, but it's kind of about how these connections could form through these records in surprising ways. When Paul Simon, right, who had been with Simon and Garfunkel, went solo, and he was looking for musicians to work with to make his first solo album, he called up Stax Records, and he asked how he could get in touch with the Jamaican musicians who were on the Staple Singers record, because he's like, this has got to be coming out of Jamaica. And of course, there's a bunch of white guys from Alabama. And there are lots of stories like that, which are sort of simultaneously kind of amusing, but also really speak to how much these musicians could transcend those boundaries. But yeah, not a direct connection necessarily, but definitely part of the mix.
Good deal. Thank you so much for responding to that.
Sure.
Again, I encourage you all, if you have any questions, to drop them in the Q&A. But we'll move ahead and we'll revisit additional questions later. Thank you so much, Dr. Hughes.
Of course. Thank you, Mike. And thank you, Dory, for that question. So in one way, I'll Take You There is such a wonderful, evocative reminder of the potential of the country soul triangle. And as a record, as a recording, you know, for teachers, I love using this song and this recording just to talk about the music of the movement era, right? Because you get the call and response between the singers and the band and between the singers themselves. You get that message of, I know a place where ain't nobody crying, ain't no smiling faces lying to the races. I'll take you there, right? It's such a great way to kind of think about the sounds of the movement and the impulses behind them. But this period also in Muscle Shoals reflects a maybe more complicated or ambivalent part of the story, because it is in the 1970s, partly because of the success of artists like the Staple Singers, that Muscle Shoals and also Memphis become sites of white artists from pop and rock and country coming to the city to work with the local musicians as brand names to try to demonstrate how they were incorporating Black music. In this period, you have just tons of these. These are just a few of them. Everyone from Dusty Springfield to the Osmond Brothers to the Rolling Stones to a returning Elvis Presley to Memphis, right? You get a ton of these recordings of white artists putting Memphis or Muscle Shoals on the album cover as a way to try to demonstrate that they were bringing in Black sound. Well, as this happened, this was part of a process in which musicians in Memphis and Muscle Shoals and Nashville increasingly used the sounds of soul to enrich both creatively and financially white people, white-owned studios, and white-identified genres. As Muscle Shoals producer Rick Hall said, the Triangle's musicians became famous and rich for, quote, taking the white music and making it sound Black. This provoked fierce criticism from Black musicians who did not benefit equally, and also from writers and other observers who saw both racial appropriation and economic displacement in the changeover, and who could recognize the aftermath or the after effects and the wake of earlier moments in which musical genre and crossing musical genre lines ultimately benefited white artists and white folks more than Black folks. Musician Clarence Carter, who had a bunch of great hits recorded in Muscle Shoals, summed it up later when he recalled that, quote, when those white guys started their studios in the South, I don't think their aim was ever to stick with Black music. And indeed, even as artists like Carter and Al Green and Millie Jackson continued making innovative hits in the country soul triangle, Southern soul increasingly became identified with the musical past. Meanwhile, country music fully incorporated soul and even disco as a symbol of how Nashville artists had created a modern sound that could appeal to everyone and had a broad-minded creative vision. Willie Nelson's album Stardust was even produced by Booker T. Jones, who I talked about before, which, to be fair, was one of the only examples in which a Black musician from Memphis, Nashville, or Muscle Shoals was brought into the country mainstream in such a way. And in fact, it would remain until the late 1990s with the rise of Southern hip-hop for the Black South to reintroduce the musical notion of country on Black records. To this day, the identifier of country particularly remains a poignant and pointed signifier of identity. The marginalization of Black musicians has been reiterated in much of the scholarship and popular memory of this time and place in music. The focus has been disproportionately on white musicians, thus rendering many of their Black colleagues secondary, passive, or even troublesome in the narrative. White musicians, who, by the way, and I do not think this is a coincidence, are almost always men, are credited with developing innovative musical styles that demonstrated racial open-mindedness and thus ultimately helped liberate the South and nation. The language around artists like Willie Nelson or Dolly Parton, and I'm not hating on those artists, right? But the language is very, very different in terms of the incorporation of Black music. On the flip side, their Black Southern counterparts get mischaracterized too often as authentic voices who helped whites become better people in the late 60s and make better music in the late 60s, and then conveniently fade into the background by the end of the next decade. This ambivalence has been buried underneath a narrative of reconciliation that, when knitted together, offers a tradition or an alternative narrative of U.S. and Southern history, a tradition of racial interaction that complicates or even contradicts the conventional understanding of the South's conflicted past. Now, don't get me wrong. There is, without question, significant importance in the correct assertion that even in the worst days of racial turmoil, musicians in the South worked together to produce something that defied both the ideology and practice of segregation. But those who promote that narrative, and there are lots of us, from Barack Obama at an event honoring Memphis Soul to me at some points in my career, have taken it further. Statements like, quote, racism did not exist in this studio, or on the bandstand everyone was the same, or we saw no difference between Black and white, are commonplace in the discourse. Southern musical spaces, both literal and figurative, have become a kind of interracial, ahistorical dreamland. This is a fallacy, not only because of the fact that African Americans did not share equally in the benefits of the music that's now routinely heralded as a demonstration of progress, but also because nothing mattered more to these musicians than understanding race and musical genre. It was central to their work, and their success at doing so, often in an integrated recording context, only adds to our understanding and appreciation for the role they played as active and transformative contributors to the messy history of race and culture in the United States. I think this is connected to the larger rhetoric around interracial friendship that has become very common in the United States in the years after the Civil Rights Movement. Interracial friendship has not only become a favorite defense against charges of personal racism, the whole, well, but some of my best friends are Black thing, but also the foundation to the argument that individual relationships can either supersede or outright disprove deeper structural inequities. The same thing has happened to the Country Soul Triangle, in which the primary beneficiaries and heroes of this supposed colorblindness and this false utopia that supposedly existed are white people. And that is neither exceptional in U.S. history, nor is it a cause for celebration. So what does the Country Soul Triangle story teach us? This is my only slide with a bunch of text on it. I really tried not to do too many texty PowerPoints, but I thought this deserved it. For one, the Country Soul Triangle story teaches us to indeed celebrate music's liberating potential without romanticizing it or denying the complexities of the work that goes on, because it is through the work that the progress happens. It teaches us to remember that recording musicians, songwriters, and producers are workers whose workplaces and whose working lives are what structured the amazing music that they make. It teaches us to think about how deeply our understanding of musical genre is connected to historical and cultural context. When we're talking about country music, or we're talking about soul music, or we're talking about heavy metal music, or we're talking about norteño music, or whatever, we are bringing to that our understanding of the world in which those recordings exist. That's not to deny that music doesn't really have a genre when you make it. You're just making music. But when that music is recorded and put out into the world, it comes along with all of that extra and sometimes complicated symbolism. It teaches us to remember that music often becomes a shorthand for identity. Listeners make meaning of the music too, right? And how that either works together or conflicts is a fascinating story in itself. When we talk about music, we are often talking in some way about how our identity works or how we think of ourselves. Genre categories are so deeply suffused with this that it has become part of how I think we all talk about music in one way or another. And I think for those of us who are trying to teach music or use music to understand these moments, it's important to recognize that and think through it. What does it mean to think about genre as a marker of identity? This has not changed, by the way, in the playlist algorithm era, right? Like in the era of streaming and the era of the playlists and Spotify and YouTube and all these platforms, I find that a lot of folks still very much think of their music listening at least structured around genre category. They might listen to all kinds of different stuff, or they might think of it in different ways, but I think this is still going on in important and interesting ways that I'm still trying to figure out. And I'm glad I have, a bunch of young people around to help me and introduce me to new ways of thinking and speaking about music. Because music is always something that is important to, or let me rephrase that. It's always important to think about the music that is important to, in this case, young folks, right? I love talking with younger people about what music they like, both so that I know what matters to them and why, but also so I can think through this stuff in a new chapter and a continuing relevance. And finally, it teaches us to keep the sound of the music at the center. You can hear on Green Onions. You can hear on I'll Take You There. And I can play many other examples of this. You can hear all of this working itself out, or at least being reinforced, right? Think of how much the sound of certain instruments indicates something to us about what kind of music it is, and therefore at least we can suspect or assume sometimes what the race or identity of the person making the music is. Even if it doesn't turn out to be true, that's still an important way we think about it. Another thing I always do with my students is I get them out of just thinking about lyrics. We are in such a word-centric culture, and our analysis of written words and text is often something that we're much more familiar with, and I would argue comfortable with. I'm the same way, by the way. I'm still that way. I still just automatically sometimes will start analyzing the words, and I'll forget about the music. And I always want folks to think about the sound, because even if you're not a trained musician, or especially if you're not someone with musical theory or language, talking about the way things sound and the way you respond to it tells us so much. There's one more thing the Country Soul Triangle teaches us that I definitely need to mention, which is that it teaches us to remember the words of the great R&B and soul artist Rufus Thomas. Near the end of his life, Thomas, who recorded hits in Memphis for 3 decades and who registered significant criticisms about the studio's racial politics during that period, said that in the Country Soul Triangle, quote, "We found out that whites and blacks as entertainers and as musicians could work together. You have people who say that it can't be done, but that's one of the biggest lies ever told." Now, a lot has happened in the world and in music since I wrote this book. One of the things about looking back, particularly now that it's 10 years later, is that I've sort of tried to figure out, what are the stories that have emerged in this larger story or this larger dynamic since then? And there are many. I wrote this book responding in some ways to the resurgence of a kind of colorblind or post-racial rhetoric in the Obama years, trying to think through the ways that the Country Soul Triangle could kind of support that rhetoric. But I don't think we're living in a world anymore in which the rhetoric of colorblindness or of being whatever post-racial was supposed to be, I don't think that's really the world we live in anymore. And also, we are living in a world in which country music has become more openly significant within the resurgence of white nationalist politics in the form of artists like Jason Aldean. But there are many other stories that I think are more important, or at least more illuminating, to tell as well. So I want to talk briefly now about one of them, which Mike signaled, and which I want to think a little bit about, which is the fact that in the last 15 years in particular, we have witnessed together an astonishing, disruptive renaissance among Black country musicians. In the last 15 years or so, we have either seen the emergence or the rise in popularity of Black country artists across the stylistic spectrum, from the most mainstream, radio-ready, radio-friendly stuff, all the way over to what we might think of as traditional or Americana, or all of these different things. These are just a few of them. I particularly want to shout out Mickey Guyton, who I know Mike played a song of hers, Black Like Me, before we got going, who not only was thinking through and trying to work through in her music what it meant to be a Black country artist trying to make it in the Nashville mainstream, but also a Black woman. Because to this day, although there has been an expanded place for Black men on the country charts or on country radio, like Darius Rucker here or others that are more recent, Black women continue to remain underrepresented and limited within that world. This is part of a larger underrepresentation and active limitation of women artists of all races within mainstream country music. But Mickey Guyton has expressed that through her music and thought it through. Whether it's artists like Guyton or Rucker, Tanner Adell, who is blending country music with Southern hip hop in ways that are really exciting and interesting. The Kentucky Gentlemen, twin brothers from Kentucky, who not only represent the Renaissance in Black country music, but also the Renaissance in queer country music. Roberta Lee from Portsmouth, Virginia, who I brought out here not only because she's great, but because she is also an English teacher. So check out Roberta Lee if you have not. And of course, the work of artists like Dom Clemens or Rhiannon Giddens, Amethyst Kia, Layla McCalla, and Allison Russell in Our Native Daughters, and solo as well, who are not only trying to think about what the music might be next, but also trying to rethink and rewrite the traditions of country music around something that is perhaps more equitable and honest about the past. A couple of big moments have occurred in the last 5 years. One is, of course, the 2019 emergence of Lil Nas X with his hit Old Town Road. Lil Nas X's emergence out of nowhere, the controversy over whether or not he should be on country radio, the removal of him from the country charts, and ultimately his huge popularity with Old Town Road symbolizes a whole awful lot. I think the Lil Nas X story tells us a lot about music in the internet age. I think it tells us a lot about queerness and queer identity, especially because, of course, Lil Nas X came out of the closet and has been very open about his queerness in ways that are not only really refreshing, but also kind of fabulous. He taps into a tradition of queer performers like Lil Richard and others who have made that identity into such a vibrant part of his art. But also because, of course, when Lil Nas X comes out and Old Town Road becomes controversial as to whether or not it is a country song, that is immediately and deeply tapping into these longer historical debates about whether or not Black artists have a legitimate place within our understanding of country music as a genre. In response to Lil Nas X being removed from the country charts, there was a social media movement and a larger movement, not only of Black musicians saying, hey, we're country and he's country, but also among Black audience members who wanted to demonstrate that not only were Black folks making country music and listening to country music, but Black folks were in country spaces and living the lives of country experiences. Now, none of that needs to be said if not for this longer history of genre, and particularly country music, being such a powerful symbol and such a powerful metaphor. And also, just to break it down and make it as plain as I can, Old Town Road is very country. And there would not, I think, have been any debate about it if Lil Nas X was not the artist that he is. But that debate symbolized not only a debate about country music, but also, of course, a debate about the borders and boundaries of the country. Who qualified as a country musician was, as it so often had been, a stand-in for who belonged in the country or whose country it was. The fact that this happens in 2019 and then continues into 2020, I don't think is a coincidence in terms of the political discourse and the political climate, either in terms of the political rhetoric around elections and other things, but also the continuing importance of the Black Lives Matter movement and what would ultimately occur in 2020 with protests surrounding the killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. A similarly evocative moment occurred in 2016, 3 years before Lil Nas X, when Beyonce appeared on the stage at the Country Music Association Awards to perform a mashup of her song Daddy Lessons with the Chicks. They were still the Dixie Chicks then. They have now dropped Dixie. They are the Chicks. A mashup of Beyonce's song Daddy Lessons with the Chicks' hit Long Time Gone. This was a remarkable performance for many reasons. One of them is that although Beyonce being at the CMAs was certainly a pretty remarkable moment, the Chicks had also not been invited back to the CMA Awards since the 2003 incident in which Natalie Maines protested the Iraq War and George W. Bush. It was also remarkable because this group of 4 musicians, all of whom are from Houston, Texas, revealed not only the sonic similarities and continuities between the Chicks' country music and Beyonce's country-influenced R&B, but also brought in a New Orleans brass band to demonstrate an even further and deeper conversation across genre lines. And also, it was noteworthy that Beyonce's Daddy Lessons was mashed up with the Chicks' Long Time Gone, which was a song that is specifically about the reclaiming and claiming of country identity. I don't think any of that was an accident. These artists are not prone to do things for no reason. And it was a really remarkable celebratory moment. Of course, it also provoked backlash, particularly on social media, from people who argued that Beyonce had no business being on a country stage. And why did the CMAs allow this imposter or this interloper to invade this sacred space of country music? Speaking of timing and not being a coincidence, the CMA Awards took place the week before the 2016 presidential election. I've been talking about Beyonce and the Chicks and the Daddy Lessons thing since it happened in 2016. I've used it as an example when teaching the possibilities, what happens when we don't adhere and when we transgress these racial genre lines. I've talked about it as being an example of artistic and musical similarity and conversation. And I've also talked about it as an example of how deeply and immediately genre conversations become conversations about race in the South and across the United States to this day. But last year, Beyonce made it even more resonant when she released her long-rumored and among many of us long-awaited country-influenced album, Cowboy Carter, which she has said, and it has actually a song on the album talking about, was in many ways directly inspired by the backlash to her appearance at the CMA Awards. Cowboy Carter is a fascinating record. It contains some really country stuff, some stuff that's not quite as country, but it's all kind of influenced by these deeper genre conversations. And it also takes up the idea of musical genre and how it relates to race and region and identity in some very direct and powerful ways. I've talked with a lot of students and others about Cowboy Carter. It is a great entryway into many of these conversations because Beyonce, as she often does, really did her homework and also tried to construct an album that, whatever you think about it, I mean, I'm not saying you gotta love the album or whatever, but it's clearly trying to make a larger statement, not only about genre and race in the present, but also in the past. On that album, she features Linda Martell, who I talked about earlier, and who has recently been reclaimed by a new generation, particularly of Black women, who are not only trying to think about the past, but also the present. This has also seen a period of tremendously important educational and advocacy work within Black country spaces. Reese Palmer, a Black country artist who was one of the many who attempted to break through the Nashville mainstream, in her case, it was sort of the late 2000s, and ultimately found frustration, has recently started the Color Me Country radio show on Apple Music and the Color Me Country Foundation, through which she spotlights young country artists of color who are working within all sorts of different musical traditions. Color Me Country Radio, in particular, is an incredible educational resource. Her interviews are fantastic. They are deep and interesting. She spotlights all kinds of amazing artists. And again, as I said before, she doesn't just spotlight Black country artists. Given the limitations of the talk and frankly, my own expertise in the area, I haven't talked much about Latinx country artists or Native and Indigenous country artists or Asian American country artists, but all of them exist and all of them are important within this story as well. And Reese Palmer features them. I highly recommend checking out her work, not only to get a sense of what's happening right now, but also as its own kind of educational resource. That radio show is really an incredible archive and listening experience. Linda Martell is also going to be the subject of a documentary made by her granddaughter, Bad Case of the Country Blues. I know that says it's coming this fall. I don't know that it is, but it hopefully will be coming soon. And that, too, will be a really important way to reframe our larger story about Black country musicians and about race and music in the South and the United States. And another organization doing crucial educational work is the Black Opry, formed by a woman named Holly G. In Nashville, who was a country music fan and wanted to start a blog to spotlight Black country artists. At the time, Holly was working as a flight attendant, but ultimately the Black Opry became so popular and so active that she now is a full-time music promoter, producer, and record company leader. The Black Opry is doing incredible work to try to amplify the voices of young Black country artists, creating opportunities that may have not existed before. This, again, is not just a great way to be introduced to cool artists doing great stuff, but it's also a great way to teach and to kind of get a sense of where the music and the story is now. And finally, the story is also being told in books. We are finally beginning to see a growing bookshelf of great books about Black country music. Hidden in the Mix, which was edited by Diane Pecknold, who I mentioned before, was an earlier essay collection, came out in 2009 or 10, I think, featuring a bunch of different authors writing about different parts of this story. I'm in this book, full disclosure, but even if I wasn't, I would definitely hype it because it's remarkable. Black Country Music by the scholar Francesca Royster is not only a kind of scholarly look at the music and the history in terms of Black country traditions, but it is also a personal memoir, bringing in Royster's own experience as a Black country fan, not just growing up, but going into country spaces and then now also teaching her daughter about the music. It's a really powerful and beautifully written book about not only a lot of these great artists and others, but also Royster's own experience and what that has meant. And finally, I have to shout out Alice Randall's My Black Country. Alice Randall is the first Black woman to have a sole writing credit on a country #1 hit song. For those of you who remember the 90s, like me, she wrote X's and O's, American Girl, the #1 hit for Trisha Yearwood. And she's worked as a Black songwriter in Nashville country music for decades. Her book, My Black Country, is both about her own experiences within country music, but also about the history of Black country music, what exactly is Black country music, and how has this music worked out even outside of what we might think of as country genre. This is a tremendous book, really important, beautifully written, and Randall is also an educator. She teaches at Vanderbilt University. Some of you might know that name, Alice Randall, because she wrote The Wind Done Gone, which was a Black retelling of Gone with the Wind, as well as other novels. And Randall teaches this stuff and has very helpfully in this book mapped out a lot of the ways to think about the different categories or ideas behind Black country music. I highly recommend all three of these books, all three of which, like the others I mentioned, are not only really valuable resources for you, for your students, but also they're just beautifully written. And I think that they will resonate, or hopefully will resonate with you, no matter what your particular interest in this subject might be. These books and Color Me Country Radio and the Black Opry and the other stuff I've talked about here at the end, all of this is the work, too. It is the work of reclaiming and rewriting not just Black country music in the past or Black country music in the present, but the larger story that is symbolized by the Country Soul Triangle in the 1960s and 70s. Just as back then, the musicians of the Country Soul Triangle in the 60s and 70s did the work of trying to think through this complicated and tangled, messy situation of race and genre and music making more generally. So too do the folks I've talked about here at the end do it as well. Then, as now, the musicians and those who are surrounding the music they make are using their deep and diverse skills to create and to amplify and to talk about music that both reflected and shaped a rapidly changing cultural and political terrain. Then, as now, they are helping us think through our own place within the story and the larger story, not just of music, but of the history that it exists within. And, of course, they are either making or introducing us to a whole lot of great and meaningful music that we can use to both be inspired by or fulfilled by, but also educated and illuminated by as well. Music is the primary way, I think, that I understand the world. And so I don't ever want to leave that out, too. And sometimes the way I understand the world is by finding a way to find some pleasure or some rest within it. And the music, of course, does that for us, too, whether it was made by folks in Memphis or Nashville or Muscle Shoals. They had a job to do, and they did it well. They still do. They changed the world back then, and they still will. Thank you all so much. I know we have some more time for questions or conversations, so please let me know if there's anything that you want to talk about or want to think through.
All right, absolutely. Virtual applause all the way around. And if anyone has any questions, I encourage you to drop them in the chat. But there's so many gems here. And in my introduction, I speak to the recordings that are available of past webinars. You all check this out on demand. Get your pen and your pencil. Definitely write down these resources, the book recommendations, the artist names, the titles. I will be doing the exact same thing immediately after this. Marcella has a question. You mentioned that the members of the Triangle were specifically thinking about the role of race in their environment and industry. Do you have any examples or quotes about their thoughts or considerations?
Absolutely. So, I mean, there's many examples of it. One of them is just the fact that they were trying to make music to appeal or to sell within a commercial marketplace that was structured by genre. So, for example, in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, in the early 1960s, where it was primarily at first a group of young white kids who loved R&B and wanted to make kind of R&B influenced music, and actually were very much not trying to make country music. But they realized that they were perhaps limited in their opportunity to do so at that time. And then a singer-songwriter named Arthur Alexander walked in the door of the studio and asked if he could record some of his songs. And they heard him sing and realized that he was just an incredible songwriter. And they also were excited by Arthur Alexander being there because he was Black. And they talk about subsequently about the fact that having a Black artist that they could work with meant that they may now have an opportunity to appeal to R&B radio or a Black audience. Also, of course, the way that, so country music, for example, gets very much identified with certain kinds of musical characteristics, right? the fiddle, the twangy guitar, the banjo. And of course, now we're thankfully, especially because of the work of Rhiannon Giddens, and who I talked a little bit about there, we are being reminded of the Black history of the banjo. But there are stories in among several artists about either sort of trying to not make something sound too country because country radio wouldn't play a Black artist, or putting things on that sounded more R&B that instead of it sounding more country. There's a great artist, for example, named Swamp Dogg, who recently had rather lovely become a sort of much bigger deal than he really ever has been. It's really wonderful. He just put out actually a bluegrass album. But Swamp Dogg was this artist, Jerry Williams is his given name. And he not only produced and wrote songs for all kinds of folks in Muscle Shoals and Nashville particularly, but he also made these really kind of fascinating recordings in the 60s and 70s that are very much influenced not only by soul, but by rock and roll and psychedelia, but also country. And when I talked to him about this, when I was back doing the original research for this, he talked about how one of the things he felt he had to do was he would make these records and he would realize that they just sounded country because he loved country music. It was the first kind of music he liked, And then he said, so then he decided that he better put horns on it, put a horn section on, because otherwise it would just sound too country. And then he said, and we know that Black people aren't making it in country. That's kind of how he phrased that. So you have a lot of different examples of that. You also have examples, of course, where that's sort of tried to be hidden right through that. So it can work several different ways, but whether they were trying to kind of transgress those genre lines, or racial lines with genre, or play into them, they were all working within a racially divided set of musical genres. And it wasn't just about the fact that soul was associated with Black people and country was associated with white people. When these folks start working, we're still talking in many cases about segregated record stores or segregated radio stations, right? So the ability to kind of successfully do this required them to be thinking about race a lot. That doesn't mean that they weren't finding ways to work around that, right? Or that they were constantly trying to limit or defy those genre lines. But it was very much something that they had to think about because of the nature of the music they were trying not only to make, but also try to make a living making. So those are a couple examples. I'm sure I'll think of 2 or 3 others as soon as we're off the call, but it is a great question. And yeah, if you hear musicians talk about this stuff, one of the things they will talk about a lot is sort of, okay, this is a country thing. This is an R&B thing, right? Which is sort of just about the style, but is also within this moment kind of an understanding of how that's playing within the conversation. The other thing that a lot of musicians, particularly studio musicians, will talk about is how much they got paid, which makes sense because this was their job. So those are just a couple examples. Again, I'm sure I'll think of others. Feel free to email me afterwards, and I'm happy to talk more when I wake up in the middle of the night tonight and I'm like, oh, why didn't I say this? That's the perfect answer to my first question. But that's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you. And another question. You're situated in Memphis. Stax Records. You've made reference to Stax Records, and several of the teachers, educators who are here right now mentioned the Stax documentary. Made reference to other work. Stax played an important, pivotal role in shaping the sound of soul music and fostering this environment of interracial collaboration. And this was during a time of significant racial tension in Memphis and throughout the South. How did the presence of Stax Records and its artistic output, how did it impact the social and the cultural fabric of the community in Memphis during its active years and its enduring legacy? And I saved that one for the end, and we can pick up on it another time.
Hit me with the big one right at the end. Yeah, no, I'm
we got another 30 minutes.
I'll try to be relatively brief because it really would be worth a whole other conversation. Actually, Xandria Robinson, who I mentioned at the top, has written really brilliantly and beautifully about the Soulsville neighborhood after Stax and kind of how the Stax legacy has played within the community. I mean, I think the the short version is that obviously Stax has a huge impact in Memphis, particularly actually within its kind of second phase in the sort of late 60s through the mid 70s before it closed, when the label really became much more active in trying to link up with the community and trying to support the Memphis community. Remember, this was also after the assassination of Martin Luther King. So Stax artists were called upon many times, but also of their own accord and of their own choice, went out and tried to sort of be community leaders, or at least kind of, ease tensions. And also there are stories about, Isaac Hayes, probably the biggest star at Stax in that second phase, working within the community on everything from like supporting local organizations of students to participating in protests around the killing of Elton Hayes by Memphis police. So it had a really important role, and the closing of Stax in the mid-70s was really a blow, especially to the Black community of South Memphis, right? Because Stax started as a neighborhood recording studio, right? Primarily composed of Black teenagers and young adults from the neighborhood, right? Who came into the studio and, wanted to make music and had been practicing. Most of them were either in band in high school or choir, or were in the church music or whatever, right? So when it closed, it was really significant and painful. And I think currently Stax maintains a really important role, but also I think this is something Stax, the current, the foundation and the museum and their music academy, they've really tried to connect the past to the present so that it's not just a museum about this thing that used to be good that existed here, but doesn't anymore. And they do a lot of great work with young folks in the community, and especially young Black folks in the community. And in a place like Memphis, Tennessee, like a lot of places, that's needed and that's important, and that's been a part of their mission from the very beginning. So it is definitely a story that requires a lot more and is a lot more complex, but it's played a very significant role both during its time, certainly, but also to this day. And I know we're right at the end of time, but I will give a shout out whenever y'all come to Memphis, and you should come to Memphis. You definitely want to check out the Stax Museum of American Soul Music. It is really, really well done, and it's just a great museum on every level, and you can learn so much more about Stax and its role in South Memphis.
Thank you for responding to that. And if I may, I have an additional question. I promise it's not another Stax question,
Sure.
but it's actually a question from Brent. Brent, thanks for submitting this question, and we can conclude on this, and I'll read it. Hi, Dr. Hughes. You mentioned Little Richard a few minutes ago as a fellow Badger, and he said, Brent points out, Brent says we met through Eric Winninger in college. You may be,
wow,
so, yeah,
amazing,
a college friend. Thanks for being here, Brent. But he says you may be familiar that this artist was banned on WAPL in Appleton, Wisconsin, because his music was considered the devil's music. I'm curious, were there quote-unquote race music stations that refused to play music recorded with the all-white Muscle Shoals house band once it became known that they were an all-white ensemble? Were there Black artists that refused to record with them after discovering their identity as well?
That's a great question. And yes, well, hello, Brett. Any friend of Eric Winninger's is a friend of mine. So, but the short answer is no. There's no stories that I know of them being banned or people refusing to play. There were, in the aftermath of the King assassination, there were a lot of Black artists who felt very concerned about the racial politics of mostly white Southern studios, and were sort of hesitant, or at least insisted on some changes in their racial politics. But what also did happen is that there were a lot of people who ended up just being very surprised by this. So there wasn't necessarily a backlash against them, but there is a lot of conversation at that time about, wow, did you all realize that these are all white musicians or whatever? Now, what did get a lot of backlash was when white artists started recording soul-influenced music with these white bands, right? The biggest example of this is the Osmond Brothers, who are an all-white group from Utah. They come to Muscle Shoals. They record a basically Jackson 5 style. Like it's a lot of people thought it was the Jackson 5, but the Osmonds' One Bad Apple comes out, and there's a massive backlash against this because this is viewed as racial appropriation at its most direct. So no, I don't know of any examples of people being banned or anything like that, but it definitely was something that white musicians talked about being something that changed in terms of the late 60s and early 70s when Black Power and kind of Afro-diasporic consciousness begins to insist more fully on, not on Black-only music, but on Black control of the music. Like, it's not necessarily about who's playing on it, who is in charge, who is benefiting from this economically and culturally. So, not yes and no, of course, and of course I'll say yes and no, but great question and definitely part of the story.
Absolutely. Again, just virtual applause. Dr. Hughes, thank you so much. I look forward to actually coming out to Memphis and checking you out, sitting in on one of your lectures. I encourage everyone who's here to get an opportunity to check out Dr. Hughes, follow him on his social media channels as well. Definitely stay up on all the things he's doing. This night was so very necessary. We just appreciate you being here. I look forward to, again, working with you. I also want to shout out my TAs who've been active in the chat as well. I saw that Michelle and Raven both received shout outs, Raven Cathey and Michelle Rich, who have been dropping links in the audience chat throughout the evening and just making this just another.
Thank you so much.
Yes, another eventful gathering. So for you all, I encourage you to follow all that's happening at the National Humanities Center, nationalhumanitiescenter.org, as well as on our social media channels as well. Support the humanities education programs. The NHC education programs provides a bridge between the academic world and the working classroom. Your gift, no matter how modest, can open up a world of ideas for teachers and rekindle their enthusiasm for the subjects that they teach by providing the knowledge and tools that they and their students need to make a difference. Again, I appreciate your ongoing support. And we will be back April 17. We'll be here with J. Elijah Bender of Concordia College, who has Bushido or Bust, Student Perceptions of Samurai and What to Do with Them. So he will be here with us then. Again, just I look forward to connecting with you all. Take care of yourself. Don't forget to get your rest and be sure that you take plenty of time for self-care. We appreciate you. And I'm going to finish out because a question that I asked, and then there was someone else in the chat who asked that question about that reggae ska song by Harry J. and All Stars. And this is for those of you who are familiar, and you heard it earlier tonight. I'll Take You There. Well, this is a song that inspired it. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Hughes. We appreciate you more than you know. Y'all take care and be well.